So for example, a blood moon happened at the cross. A blood moon happened at the Exodus. And those blood moons represent unique times throughout redemptive history. And if you remember, about 2 years ago, the 2 blood moons happened on the same date, which was when same time Christ died on the cross. Wow. Now remember, there's total darkness, so when that moon rose that day, it would have been a blood moon, because there was darkness over the whole land. Same thing in Goshen. There was darkness over all of Goshen, and when they're coming out that night, there's a blood moon rising, and they're coming out of Egypt. So a blood moon is deliverance. Deliverance from physical Egypt, and Christ is trying to deliver Israel from spiritual Egypt, because they literally were in bondage in their own land in Israel. He's leading them out of Israel, which would be spiritual Egypt. Now, other tokens are sent to the bride to remember their courtship. So the bride will be looking forward to a certain date. So what would we see that would remind us of the first day of creation? The first thing that's mentioned is this, that the earth was without form and void. And the Hebrew phrase is tohu bohu. It's a little wordplay. It means that there's confusion, there's chaos, and people do not understand what's going on, what's actually going on. The deep, which represents the seas or the vast oceans, there's darkness. So this is going to be the conditions when Christ returns. Is the nations are going to be in chaos, the waves and the sea roaring. And then Israel, represented by the earth, is going to be confused, and there's going to be chaos. And these are going to be the conditions which we see now, the distress of nations. Luke talks about the sea and the waves roaring. We see this now, literally and figuratively. Now, why this is important is, also in Deuteronomy 32:8, God says that when He set the borders for all the nations throughout all of history, Deuteronomy 32:8, He did it according to the number of the sons of Jacob. That meant from the very beginning to the very end, wherever the Jews were, He was going to set sovereign borders and boundaries. Sometimes that's called the tents of Japheth, because Shem would dwell there. And He would know exactly where they are and why they're there. And we see that now. And this is important because, as you know, there are many Jews who live in the United States. And that was one of the things we talked about last time. Now, the reason that's important is, right now things are going on and people don't know why. If you know anything about Jewish culture in America, the Jews first settled in this country in Texas and in Florida. And the reason why is the Jews came over through New Spain, through Columbus. And when they came over, they were on the 3 ships that Columbus came over. And Ponce de Leon, down in southern Florida, actually started a colony. His whole crew were Sephardic Jews from Spain. Wow. Jews also came across from Mexico and Central America into Texas, which at that time was New Spain. And they actually started, and many of them were believers. Everyone thinks that throughout every generation all Jews are unbelievers. Many were believers because they have the documents from them. And they were actually believers, but they were expelled from Spain because of Ferdinand and Isabella's edict. So what happened was, they came to New Spain, and then they started chasing them down through the Inquisition, so they came across into what we know as the United States of America. The problem is, at that time, it wasn't the United States of America, it was New Spain. So that kingdom existed at that time. That's why if you follow the path of the total solar eclipse, it's all New Spain territory where Judah settled. Wow. So if you would go... Yeah,
and that happened right after the 4 moon too, when the persecution began in Spain.
I was going to bring that up. The 4 blood moons in 1492. Yes.
Well,
it was a sign, actually, to Spain, as a Japhetic nation, that they were expelling God's people, covenant people. And right after that, Spain became probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest nation in the world, to one of the weakest. From 1492, by 1526, Spain's no longer a world power, based on expelling the Jews. Wow. The Spanish Armada was one of the strongest navies in the history of the world. Then England becomes one of the strongest navies after the decline of Spain. Now that's interesting because England and Spain are battling out right here in what we call the United States of America for much of the territory. But this actual solar eclipse started up in the Portland, Seattle area where there's a huge Jewish community, been there since the days of the conquistadors, and if you watch the trail, it's all the kingdom of Judah. It's all about Judah, the kingdom of Judah. Because Sephardic Jews are from the kingdom of Judah. Right? They're not the 10 tribes of Israel, it's Judah. And the sun is actually a symbol of the king of Judah, Christ himself. Wow. So this was a sign, a great sign to the kingdom of Judah, that he's about to shake the heavens and the earth to bring back Judah to the land of Judah. So all these Jews, I think it was 1.8 million Jews, for the first time had to leave Florida and come out of Florida. And the same thing in Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, where the other concentration of Sephardic Jews are. Right? Now what's interesting, Judah is always associated with the south because in Israel, Israel's to the north, Samaria is the capital of Israel, and Judah and Jerusalem are to the south. So God always starts in the south when he's working on Judah. So world power, right here, United States of America, Japheth, Shem is in here. So he's shaking the heavens and the earth, telling the Jews, just like he did in Egypt, he's sending great signs that he wants them to come back to the land. All right? Wow. Any questions about that? So, yeah.
Question. So is it because in New York you have the Ashkenazi Jews? Is that why they're not? Because if you think of Jewish population in the United States, you think New York or Maryland. But is it because they're not Sephardic? Is that why they're sort of not part of?
Yeah, well he's also going to deal with their Israel. He's also going to deal with Israel. But he's going to deal with Judah first. So the Ashkenazi communities that exist in Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, there are even some up in Boston. There are a lot of Ashkenazi Jews in Boston.
Are those Hasidic Jews?
Some of them are Hasidic, yeah.
These are the ones that came from Europe. Like the Sephardic Jews came from Spain and Portugal. And,
yeah.
Right? Is that
And that
right?
was 3 tribes basically, wasn't that?
It's actually only 2 tribes. It's Benjamin and Judah. Now Levi was the third, which was in the center. So there are Levites in Judah and in Israel. Because depending upon, for example, Jeremiah talks about living in the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah.
But he's actually has Levitical heritage too. So you did have Levites also living amongst Benjamin and Judah. But the major Ashkenazi communities are associated with the north of the United States of America, and the Sephardic are associated with the south.
How about the Covenant Synagogue in Rhode Island?
Yes.
What was where?
They came from Portugal and Spain, and they actually settled in that area because of originally because of shepherding needs. They needed shepherds. And they came over from Portugal and Spain. And they were involved actually in shipping at that time. So if you go to Newport, Rhode Island, you'll see the Gold Coast there. It looks like another world.
Yes, I've been there.
Because these were the people that are controlling the shipping and the insurance all throughout the triangular trade. And that is considered a very unique spot. And that's where George Washington made his covenant with the Jews at that synagogue he visited. So the only 2 presidents ever to visit a synagogue were George Washington at the Newport Synagogue, and then Ronald Reagan visited a synagogue in New York at that time, 1980, I believe it was 1984. But Trump was at the dinner in 1984 with Reagan.
Wow.
And also at the dinner was the current ambassador to Israel, whose name is King David Friedman. That's his name, King David Melech Friedman. He was there. Now, what's even more interesting is when God says he's going to shake the heavens and the earth to bring them back, there's another interesting verse, is Proverbs 21:1, which talks about the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. But there's an interesting metaphor. It says, as the rivers in the seas. Now the rivers and the seas refer to currents, which can go hot or cold. And then it says, he turneth it wheresoever he wills, which means those rivers and the seas, like the Gulf Stream in our country, energize hurricanes and storms. And they can turn left, they can turn right, they can go back, they can loop back out to sea. But what God is saying is, when he set the boundaries of the nations in Deuteronomy 32:8, when he chose those actual lands, he also knew the rivers and currents that surrounded those lands, which would affect the navies that come out of that country, and it would affect navigation, and it would also affect the storms. So when the storms come across from Africa and get energized in the Atlantic Ocean, if the Gulf Stream is cold, that could shut down a hurricane. But if it's warm like it is now, it can actually energize a hurricane. And that's exactly what happened. Those two hurricanes went to the exact spots where the Sephardic Jews are.
I know.
So that's not a coincidence.
Wow.
Right, an
That's
interesting testimony.
Crazy.
Jackie and I planned to see her mother. She had to sit in a special meeting with the people that control her mother's destiny. And we decided we would go to St. Pete, where we had our honeymoon, and go to the beach. So we went there, and the weather was just really weird weather. It was cool out. The wind was blowing ferociously, and the tropical winds had started raining.
It's a tropical storm.
Yeah, it was actually a tropical storm. We went in the water. It was just like going in a bathtub. The water was already
Yeah, it was very.
really hot. And I said to her, I
love
said,
that.
imagine if this was a hurricane day. This water would soup up a hurricane. Unbelievable. It was right there, St. Pete, which was Ponce de Leon kind of territory.
Yeah.
So, this is testimony. It's true.
Are they aware that God did that?
I would say, for the most part, no.
No.
And actually, he actually says that if you read the prophets, he says, I'm really going to have to shake you out to get you to come back. And he says many of them, and this isn't easy to even talk about or accept, but it's a 2/3, 1/3 pattern. That he's saying basically 2/3 are actually going to perish in the lands where they won't come out of. And really he's going to deal with 1/3. Zechariah mentions this. He's going to deal with 1/3 and refine them like fire back in Israel, which is a remnant that's going to get saved. So they're in their prevenient grace or pre-salvation status, a lot of them. But God's still watching them. He knows exactly where they are. He knows why they're there, what he's going to do with them, and how he's going to deal with them. And he says that. However, there's another group of people, and that would be, in this country especially, you have those who are spiritual Israel, which would be the church.
Right.
And that's why Yom Teruah is important, because Yom Teruah has to do with spotting light and seeing light. And God's word is light. And you are light because God's word's in you. So really the rapture, when it does occur, the harpazo in Greek, or in Hebrew it's called natsal, which means the catching away, or the throwing up of light. Now what's interesting is when the Jewish bride was actually snatched by the bridegroom and his company, they picked her up and actually threw her way up into the air. Most people aren't aware of this. And actually caught her
Wow.
on this hookah. And they were all holding torches. Some were holding torches. So she was actually bathed in light, and they threw her way up in the air and they caught her. And then they would carry her dancing and singing to the action, all the way down. And sometimes it would take quite a long time to get down some of the, if you're at Hebron, for example, you're coming down a mountain, you see the torches and the singing. So it was quite an event to watch a bride snatching, when they actually snatched the bride.
Wow.
Everyone in the community knew. Right. And that metaphor is even used about the theft of the bride. It's a bride theft. Okay, he comes like a thief. But he doesn't come like a thief in the night to those that are in the light. He comes like a thief in the night to those that are in the darkness. And Paul brings this out in 1 Thessalonians 5. That you know.
Yeah.
Now why is this important? Because Paul is getting all of 1 Thessalonians 5 from where? The first day of creation.
Yes.
He talks about night and day, light and darkness,
Oh, wow.
and he gets that from the first time it's mentioned. So he's saying, you're of the light. You don't need me to tell you about the times and the
Yeah.
seasons. And the times and the seasons would mean the festival and the appointment. But you don't need me to tell you the date, because you should already know the date if you're of the light. Any questions about that? Okay. Now, why is this important? Because on this date, something unique is going to happen that's been talked about for about 6, 7, 8 months on the internet, and that is this unique constellation alignment that's going to occur on this night. The night they would normally look up just to sight the new moon, there's going to be another event to see, and that is involving the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, why is this important? Because the bride is always associated with feet and the moon, because the bride is the moon. But this time the moon is under the bride's feet. And since the moon represented Israel throughout its history, the feast days, this time the woman would represent spiritual Israel that's conquered the feasts and is now clothed with the sun. So the sun would be the bridegroom, and the bridegroom always gives, in a Jewish wedding, the bride and also all members of the actual bridal group their clothes. So the parable where the king walks in and sees a man without the right garments on,
Yeah.
the reason he knows that is he gives the garments out.
Mm.
So it's like, how did this guy get in here?
Wow.
So that would represent, as he was talking about earlier, the impartation of righteousness, the robe of righteousness that the king already gave you. You're not in there unless you're clothed in that robe of righteousness. So the man that doesn't have that robe of righteousness is going to stand out, which means he doesn't have the light of Christ.
I just wanted to remind everyone,